Here's a fact that should stop you. The Neanderthal brain was, on average, larger than yours. Not equal, larger. So if the story you learned in school is smarter humans showed up, dumber Neanderthals lost, that story is already broken before it even starts. Beat. Here's the version most people know. Smarter humans arrived, dumber Neanderthals couldn't compete. In a story. It's clean, it's satisfying, and it's almost entirely wrong. The population that replaced Neanderthals didn't win by outthinking them. What actually happened, what the fossils, the genomes, and 40 years of updated paleoanthropology show, is stranger, more specific, and honestly more uncomfortable than the simple version. When Homo sapiens walked into Europe around 45,000 years ago, Neanderthals had already been living there for 400,000 years. They knew the terrain. They knew the migration routes of the prey. They knew which river crossings were safe, which caves were shelters, and which were death traps. These weren't naive animals meeting a predator for the first time. They were experienced survivors of actual ice ages. And within roughly 10,000 years, they were gone. So what happened? Not one thing. 4 things, at the same time, feeding into each other. Look at any one of them alone, and you'll miss the real picture. Put all 4 together, and you get the closest thing science has to an answer for what a Neanderthal population should have actually feared. Beat. 1. The weapon gap. When Neanderthals and sapiens first crossed paths, they didn't look wildly different. Sapiens, slimmer, longer limbs, rounder skull. Neanderthal, stockier, heavy brow, built by 400,000 years in the cold. Both walked upright. Both carried stone tools. On the surface, recognizably similar. But the tools weren't similar at all. Sapiens had spear throwers, basically a hooked stick that acts like an extension of your arm, whipping a spear out at much higher speed and distance. 15, 20 meters. That means you can hit your target and never enter the range where it can hit you back. Neanderthals didn't fight or hunt that way. Their skeletons tell the story. Healed injuries clustered in the shoulders and arms, the exact pattern you'd see in modern rodeo riders. People who get hurt from being right next to something big and dangerous. Neanderthals hunted mammoths and rhinos by walking up and stabbing them. Up close. Every time. Now picture that same close-range approach used against a group that can hit you from 20 meters and walk away clean. It doesn't matter who's smarter, braver, or better organized. In that specific matchup, range wins. Nobody knows for certain how often direct conflict happened between the two groups. The evidence at contact zones is thin. But biomechanically, if it happened, the outcome wasn't really in question. Think about it in modern terms for a second. It's the difference between a boxer and someone holding a rifle. The boxer might have better instincts, better reflexes, better read on the fight. None of that matters once distance becomes the deciding factor. This is the same asymmetry, just playing out over thousands of years instead of a single afternoon. Beat. 2. The disease nobody saw coming. This is the part most people have never heard, and it might be the biggest factor of all. Sapiens didn't walk straight from Africa into Europe. They moved through the Middle East first. A completely different set of environments, climates, and pathogens. Your immune system isn't just built by what you personally survive. It's built by thousands of years of your ancestors surviving specific diseases, and that resistance gets written into your genes and passed down. It's less like a skill you learn and more like a security patch baked into the hardware. So when sapiens finally reached Europe, they were carrying immune defenses tuned to a completely different disease landscape and pathogens that European Neanderthal populations had zero inherited defense against. Sound familiar? It's the same brutal pattern that hit indigenous American populations after Europeans arrived in the 1500s. Two populations, separated by thousands of years of different disease histories, suddenly collide, and the result has nothing to do with intelligence or culture. It's just biology. The same mechanism, quieter and slower, was almost certainly running when sapiens entered Europe. And here's where it gets concrete. Every non-African human alive today carries 1 to 4% Neanderthal DNA. That's not scattered randomly through your genome. It's concentrated specifically in genes tied to immune function, skin, and cold tolerance. Genes tied to fertility between the two species? Basically absent. That pattern is exactly what you'd expect if useful code got kept and incompatible code got discarded. Like a software update where only the working patches survive. In plain terms, Neanderthals had spent 400,000 years building immunity to European diseases. When sapiens showed up carrying something new, interbreeding handed some of that immunity over to sapiens. Sapiens got the protection. Neanderthals kept absorbing whatever sapiens brought with them. And this wasn't a one-time event during a single meeting between two groups. It was ongoing generation after generation, in every region where the two populations overlapped. A slow, repeated exposure with no vaccine, no medicine, nothing except whatever inherited resistance a body happened to carry. Multiply that across dozens of contact zones over 10,000 years, and you get a population under constant biological pressure it had no way to prepare for. Beat. 3. The numbers game. At their peak, total Neanderthal population across all of Europe was probably somewhere between a few tens of thousands and maybe 100,000, spread thin in small, disconnected groups. That isolation meant something else, too. Even a useful adaptation in one group had a hard time spreading to the others. Sapiens, meanwhile, were part of a much bigger demographic wave, backed by larger populations across Africa and the Middle East that had been growing for longer. You don't need a war for that math to matter. A tiny edge, slightly better food efficiency, slightly higher birth rate, slightly lower child mortality, compounds over thousands of years into total population replacement. No dramatic battle required. Just math, running quietly in one direction, generation after generation, until the smaller population is gone. Beat. 4. The network effect. This is the one that actually explains why a bigger brain, sophisticated tools, burial rituals, and symbolic art still weren't enough. Sapien sites from this era show shells, ochre, and specific stone types that were carried or traded hundreds of kilometers for where they came from. Neanderthal sites? Almost everything is sourced locally. That tells us sapiens groups were plugged into much wider social networks. And that mattered enormously, because information could travel through those networks. A hunting trick that worked. A better tool design. A warning that a disease was moving through a valley 3 regions over. All of it spread faster and farther through sapiens networks than it ever could through smaller, more isolated Neanderthal groups. This has nothing to do with raw brain power. The Neanderthal brain was bigger. The hardware wasn't the problem. Think of it like 2 identical computers. Same processor, same specs, except one is connected to the internet and one isn't. The connected one keeps getting updates, keeps adapting, keeps improving. The offline one is stuck running whatever it's shipped with. When both groups lived in stable, unchanging environments, that difference barely mattered. But the moment a competitor showed up bringing new weapons, new diseases, and population pressure, all at once, across a wide front, the network that could share information and adapt faster had a structural edge that just kept compounding year after year. Picture 2 neighboring sapiens groups, 300 kilometers apart, who've never met face to face. One group figures out a better way to nap a blade, or here's a rumor about a river crossing that's gone bad. Through trade contacts, through occasional meetings, through people who married into a group 2 valleys over, that information eventually reaches the other group. A Neanderthal group, living the same distance apart, had no equivalent pipeline. Whatever they learned alone, and whatever a neighboring Neanderthal group learned stayed with them. Beat. What it actually looked like on the ground. None of this hit Neanderthal groups like a single catastrophe. The archaeological signature is a slow squeeze, territorial contraction stretched out over thousands of years. Sites in Europe get rarer, then stop appearing altogether, with a few of the last known populations possibly hanging on in southern Iberia until around 40,000 years ago. It played out slowly enough that no single generation ever saw the whole pattern. But it was fast enough, relentless enough, that the total result was still complete disappearance. What any one Neanderthal actually lived through was smaller and more immediate. Territory suddenly contested. Prey harder to find in spots, that had always been reliable. Running into a group that looked almost like them, same rough shape, same genus, familiar-looking tools, but wasn't quite right. Different weapons, a different way of hunting, present in places they'd never shown up before. And this same period is exactly when the interbreeding happened. The interbreeding whose evidence still sits in your genome right now, if you have non-African ancestry. This wasn't a clean, one-sided extinction event. It was tangled, extended, and it produced descendants. Us. Imagine being the last generation in one of those valleys. You're not watching a war. You're watching your hunting grounds get a little smaller every few years. You're watching a neighboring group, familiar enough to recognize, foreign enough to be wary of, move a little closer each season. Nobody in that valley could have zoomed out and seen this is a species going extinct. They just saw their world getting quietly harder to live in. Beat. Did Neanderthals know what was coming? Fear doesn't fossilize, so we'll never know for sure. But the shape of the threat is clear. Weapons that reached farther than close-range specialists could counter. Diseases nobody was built to survive. Social networks spreading information faster than isolated groups could match. And population math quietly compounding in one direction for thousands of years. No single battle required, all four forces reinforcing each other at once. The last known Neanderthal populations were small, scattered, isolated, possibly holding on in refuges in southern Iberia and along the Atlantic coast until about 40,000 years ago. Still using the tools their ancestors had used. Still hunting the same prey, in the same cold territory their bodies have been built for across 400,000 years. And then, the record just ends. Beat. But here's the part that actually matters. They didn't just vanish. Their DNA is in billions of people walking around today. The immune adaptations built over 400,000 years of surviving in Europe are still working, right now, in modern bodies. Cold tolerance genes are still being actively maintained by natural selection in populations living in northern climates today. The Neanderthal didn't disappear. It partly became something else, us. Whether that counts as a kind of survival or just a kind of absorption is genuinely still an open question, and the researchers closest to this data leave it open too. More evidence is coming. Some of what's uncertain now will get clearer. But what it actually felt like in those final generations, what it was like to be a population slowly losing ground with no way to see the whole shape of what was happening. That's the one part the fossils will never be able to tell us. Beat. If this just rewired how you think about where you come from, send it to one person who needs their whole mental picture of cavemen wrecked. And if you've got non-African ancestry, part of this story is sitting in your DNA right now. Subscribe. New deep dive every week, and I promise the next one hits just as hard.